He's basically useless at home, Jessica said with a laugh that made the entire room follow her like it was the funniest truth she had ever told, and for a second I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe the way a normal man would in that situation, because when you've lived long enough in silence you learn that not every moment demands a reaction, some moments demand observation. I stood near the edge of the living room where the light from the kitchen spilled across polished hardwood floors, holding a half-finished glass of sparkling water that had already gone warm in my hand, watching as my wife, Jessica Walker, sat comfortably surrounded by her closest friends like she was the center of a stage she had rehearsed for, and the way she said it wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was casual. Almost affectionate in the way people described something they stopped respecting a long time ago. Her friends reacted instantly, laughter filling the room in layers, first soft, then louder, then comfortable enough to settle in the air like they had all agreed I was the kind of man who existed only as background noise in her life. And I didn't interrupt it because interrupting would have meant I accepted the role they had assigned me. Instead, I let it happen. I let every second unfold fully, like I was studying a situation I had already decided not to correct in the moment. Mark Reynolds, sitting closest to Jessica, leaned forward with that kind of confident grin people wear when they think they've understood someone in under 5 seconds, adding a comment I didn't even need to hear clearly to know it was meant to land on me. And beside him Lily Carter laughed a little too quickly, like she was afraid silence might make her complicit in something she didn't fully understand. The room was warm, maybe 72 degrees, the kind of controlled comfort that makes people talk louder than they normally would, and I could hear the faint sound of ice clinking in glasses, the soft hum of conversation that existed before I walked into it, and would have continued long after I left. I remember thinking how strange it was that a single sentence could reshape an entire room, not because of its truth, but because of how easily people choose to accept it when it gives them permission to laugh. Jessica didn't look at me when she said it again, softer this time, as if reinforcing the idea for anyone who might have missed it the first time, and that's when I noticed something else, something quieter than laughter, the way people started to glance at me not to see my reaction, but to see if I was going to provide one. That expectation hung in the air heavier than the laughter itself, like the room had turned into a test I hadn't agreed to take. I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to acknowledge I was still there, still present, still listening, and that subtle movement changed nothing on the surface but everything underneath it, because silence is never empty when it is chosen. Jessica finally looked at me then, briefly, like checking a box she had already marked complete in her mind, and smiled the kind of smile you give someone you believe has already accepted their place in your story. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was already deciding when it would matter most that I hadn't said anything yet. And in that moment, while her friends continued laughing and the room continued spinning in its comfortable illusion, I understood something simple and final. They didn't think I was dangerous. They didn't think I was important, and that was exactly why I didn't need to prove anything to them right away. The laughter had not fully faded when I noticed the first shift in the room, not in sound, but in attention, because once people decide what you are, they start watching to see if you will agree with them. Jessica continued talking with her friends as if nothing important had happened, her voice blending effortlessly into the rhythm of casual conversation, but I could feel the way the group's energy subtly adjusted around me, like I had become a fixed point they were all unconsciously orbiting. I took a slow step toward the side of the room where the lighting was softer, not because I was avoiding anyone, but because I wanted a better view of everything at once, the faces, the expressions, the small unguarded reactions that people only show when they believe the subject is not paying attention. Jessica reached for her glass again, her nails tapping lightly against the surface of the table as she leaned into a news story, and I realized she was not just speaking about me anymore, she was building a shared version of me, one that was easier for everyone to accept in that moment. Mark Reynolds added a comment that triggered another wave of laughter, and this time even Lily Carter seemed more relaxed, as if the earlier remark had opened a door where it was now acceptable to treat me as a background detail instead of a person in the room. I remained still, holding my glass lower now, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral, not because I was disconnected, but because I was observing patterns that most people miss when they are busy reacting. There is a specific kind of confidence people develop when they believe they are socially safe, and that confidence was filling the room quickly, spreading from one conversation to another like a shared agreement that nothing in this situation carried consequences. Jessica glanced at me again, briefly, then turned away before any response could form, and that single motion told me more than her words ever could, because it confirmed she was not expecting resistance, not even in thought. I noticed the way her friends leaned in slightly when she spoke, how they validated her tone with small nods and soft laughter, reinforcing a structure that placed me outside of it. The air felt warm, steady, controlled, the kind of environment where people lose awareness of how sharp their words can become when they are not challenged. I set my glass down carefully on a nearby surface, not to make a sound, but to remove distraction from my hands, and in that quiet action I felt the room continue without me acknowledging it. Jessica's voice rose slightly as she continued, describing me in a way that was simplified enough to be digestible, and I understood then that this was not about truth, it was about alignment, about group comfort, about how quickly people can agree on a version of reality that requires the least emotional effort. I could have interrupted at any point, but interruption would have changed nothing except the timing of what was already unfolding, so I stayed where I was, letting each moment complete itself fully. Mark leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the direction the conversation had taken, while Lily adjusted her hair and looked away as if suddenly aware she might have laughed a little too easily. Jessica finally paused, just long enough for silence to appear, and in that silence she seemed to expect something from me, a reaction, a correction, a defense, something to confirm the role she had assigned. I did not give her any of those things. Instead, I looked at the room as a whole, not at individuals, but at the structure they had created together in my absence, and I understood that what they thought of me in that moment was not important. What mattered was that they believed it was final, and people who believe something is final rarely notice when it begins to change. The silence I maintained in the room was not empty, it was structured, and as the conversation continued around me I began to notice how quickly people adapt when they believe they have already defined someone's place in their social hierarchy. Jessica's voice carried again, smoother now, more confident, as if the earlier laughter had given her permission to continue shaping the narrative without resistance, and I could see how easily that narrative was being absorbed by everyone present. Mark Reynolds had shifted his posture slightly, leaning back with the relaxed certainty of someone who believes the moment has already been decided, while Lily Carter occasionally glanced at me and then away, as if avoiding direct acknowledgement might protect her from responsibility for participating in it. I did not move from where I stood, because movement in moments like this is often mistaken for reaction, and reaction is exactly what people expect when they believe they have control of the emotional environment. Instead, I observed the rhythm of the room, the timing of laughter, the pauses between sentences, the subtle ways confidence spreads when it is not interrupted. Jessica's tone became lighter. As she continued speaking, almost playful, as if she had forgotten entirely that I was present, even though I was standing less than 15 feet away, and that detail alone revealed more about the dynamics of the room than anything she was saying. There is a specific shift that happens in groups when a shared assumption goes unchallenged, a kind of invisible agreement that reduces complexity, and I could see that agreement forming in real time around me. I noticed how Mark added another comment that did not require response, only agreement, and how the group supplied that agreement without hesitation, reinforcing a structure that had quietly become stable in less than 10 minutes. Jessica adjusted her position slightly, crossing one leg over the other as she spoke, and I realized she was no longer performing for me, she was performing for them, which meant I had already been categorized as something outside of relevance. That realization did not create emotion, it created clarity, because clarity removes the need for immediate response. I took a small step backward, not leaving the space, but expanding my perspective of it, and from that distance I could see how every person in the room was participating in a shared comfort built on a simplified version of reality. Even the laughter had become less sharp now, more routine, as if it was repeating itself for reinforcement rather than discovery. Jessica finally paused again, this time longer, and for a brief moment her eyes scanned the room as if checking whether her point had been fully received, and when she saw the nods and smiles she was expecting, she relaxed into her seat. That relaxation was important, because it marked the moment where perception becomes assumption, and assumption becomes certainty. I remained still, holding that certainty in front of me like an object I was studying rather than resisting, and I understood that nothing in this room needed to be corrected immediately for the situation to eventually shift. The energy had already established its direction, and people rarely notice when a direction changes until they are forced to reorient. I looked at Jessica once more, not with frustration, not with disagreement, but with the awareness that she believed the version of me she had described was complete, and completeness is often where real change begins, because what is considered finished is no longer defended. The awareness I had in that room did not fade as the conversation continued around me, it simply deepened, becoming less about what was being said and more about how easily people settle into a version of reality once it feels socially approved. Jessica's voice still carried through the space, lighter now, almost effortless, as if the earlier moment of laughter had unlocked a permission she did not realize she had been waiting for, and the others responded in the same rhythm, reinforcing her tone without hesitation. I remained where I was, not because I was participating, but because I was mapping the structure of the moment itself, noticing how attention flows toward confidence even when that confidence is built on incomplete understanding. Mark Reynolds checked his phone briefly, then returned his attention to the group with the same casual expression, as if nothing in this conversation required deeper thought, while Lily Carter adjusted her position slightly, mirroring the group's comfort without adding anything of her own. Jessica leaned forward again, continuing to describe me in simplified terms, and I realized she was no longer trying to explain, she was finalizing a version of me that would remain unchanged in their memory unless something forced it to change. That realization did not create resistance inside me, it created structure, because structure allows for timing, and timing is often more important than reaction. I took a slow breath, letting the room continue without interruption, and for the first time I allowed my attention to move away from the people and toward the unseen layer beneath the interaction. My phone remained in my pocket, silent, but I was aware of it in a different way now, not as a device, but as a connection point to something outside this room that no one else was considering. A few seconds passed before I felt the subtle vibration, not loud, not urgent, just precise, and I did not move immediately to acknowledge it because urgency belongs to perception, not control. Instead, I waited until the conversation reached a natural pause, until Jessica had finished a sentence, and the group had filled the space with their predictable response, and only then did I step slightly aside, enough to create distance without drawing attention. I took the phone out slowly, turning the screen toward myself, and saw a single message appear with no additional context, no explanation, just one word that carried more weight than anything spoken in the room so far, and in that moment I understood that the situation I was observing was not isolated to this living room or this group of people. It was part of something already in motion beyond their awareness. I did not react externally, there was no change in expression, no visible shift in posture, because the value of information is not measured by how quickly it is shown, but by how precisely it is used. I locked the screen again and returned the phone to my pocket with the same calm movement, and when I looked back toward the room, nothing appeared different on the surface, yet everything had already begun to move in a different direction beneath it. Jessica was still speaking, still confident in the version of events she had presented, but now her words felt suspended in something temporary rather than final. Mark laughed at something small, Lily nodded, and the room continued to maintain its structure, unaware that structure is only stable until it is redefined. I took one step back into the space, not to rejoin it, but to remain present within it while no longer belonging to its assumptions, and in that position I understood that what they saw as conclusion was only the midpoint of something they had not yet been introduced to. The message I saw had not been explained, and that was intentional on my part, because some information does not require immediate interpretation to have an effect. It only requires acknowledgement that it exists. I returned my attention to the room with the same steady composure I had maintained since the beginning of the evening, and nothing about my posture suggested urgency or disruption, yet internally the structure of what I was observing had already shifted. Jessica continued speaking, her tone now fully relaxed, as if the earlier moment of laughter had permanently secured her position in the group dynamic, and her friends responded with the same ease, unaware that ease is often the final stage before a shift in direction. I watched the subtle rhythm of their interaction, the way conversation flows when no one expects contradiction, and I understood that the confidence in this room was built on the assumption that nothing outside of it could meaningfully interfere. Mark Reynolds leaned forward again to add a comment, this time softer, more conversational, as if reinforcing familiarity rather than judgment, and Lily Carter nodded in agreement without hesitation, mirroring the group's emotional temperature rather than shaping it. Jessica finally glanced in my direction again, but only briefly, like a passing confirmation that I was still present and still unchanged in her mind, and she continued speaking as if that fact required no further consideration. I remained still for a moment longer, letting the silence inside me match the rhythm of the room without entering it, and I realized how quickly people confuse absence of reaction with absence of awareness. My phone remained in my pocket, but I was conscious of it now in a different way, not as a device awaiting use, but as a signal that something outside this controlled environment had already begun to interact with it. I took a slow step toward the edge of the room where the lighting was less direct, not to withdraw, but to reposition within the space in a way that allowed observation without participation. Jessica's voice rose slightly as she finished another statement, and laughter followed again, lighter than before, more habitual than deliberate, and I noticed how repetition creates comfort even when the content remains unchanged. In that repetition, people stop evaluating meaning and start reinforcing identity, and that was exactly what was happening here. I checked the time briefly, not out of impatience, but out of alignment, because timing had become the only variable that mattered. A second vibration reached my attention, subtle but precise, and this time I allowed myself to look without hesitation. The screen lit up again with another short message, equally minimal, equally controlled, and I did not need additional context to understand that whatever was unfolding was now transitioning from preparation to execution of sequence. I did not react outwardly. There was no change in facial expression or movement that would indicate disruption, because disruption is only visible when someone is still operating inside the expected frame. Instead, I allowed the information to settle without interpretation, and in doing so I recognized that the environment I was standing in was now functionally separated from the environment that was beginning to form outside of it. Jessica laughed at something one of her friends said, unaware that the structure supporting her certainty was no longer static, and Mark leaned back again, satisfied with the atmosphere they had collectively created, while Lily adjusted her posture in sync with the group's comfort. I looked across the room one more time, not at any individual, but at the entire constructed assumption they were operating within, and I understood that the next change would not come from argument or confrontation, but from the introduction of something they had not accounted for. I took one final step to the side, aligning myself closer to the exit point of the space, not leaving, but preparing, because in moments like this presence is no longer about participation, it is about positioning, and positioning determines what you see when everything begins to change. The room had not changed on the surface, yet I could feel it beginning to separate into layers, like something quietly reorganizing itself beneath the comfort everyone else still believed was stable. Jessica was still speaking, her voice steady, almost effortless now, as if the earlier laughter had fully settled into confidence rather than momentary amusement, and her friends continued to respond in the same predictable rhythm, reinforcing each other without questioning the foundation of what they were agreeing on. I remained near the edge of the space, not withdrawing, not engaging, but holding a position that allowed me to observe without contributing to the structure they were building. There is a difference between being ignored and being underestimated, and in that moment I could clearly see which one had been chosen for me. Jessica tilted her head slightly as she spoke, emphasizing a point about me that was not meant to be challenged, and the group responded with small nods and soft expressions of agreement, as if the matter had already been resolved long before I entered the room. Mark Reynolds checked his phone again, this time more casually, no longer invested in shaping the conversation but still comfortable within it, while Lily Carter adjusted her glass on the table with a slow, controlled motion that mirrored the group's calm confidence. I could hear the faint sound of a notification from somewhere in the room, but no one reacted to it, and that lack of reaction reinforced how insulated this environment had become. I took a step slightly closer to the doorway, not to leave, but to align myself with the boundary between what they believed was happening and what was actually developing outside their awareness. My phone remained in my pocket, and I did not need to look at it to understand that whatever had been initiated earlier was now progressing beyond simple communication. Jessica laughed softly at something one of her friends said, and the sound carried through the room with ease, but I noticed something subtle in her expression, a kind of relaxation that comes from believing control has already been established. That belief is often the most fragile point in any system, because it removes the need for vigilance. I shifted my attention briefly to the entrance of the room, where light from the hallway created a narrow contrast against the warm interior, and I realized how static everything inside still appeared compared to what was beginning to form outside of it. Mark leaned forward to say something quieter, and the group responded with polite amusement, maintaining the social rhythm that had carried them through the evening. Jessica glanced in my direction once more, but there was still no expectation in her eyes, only confirmation of a role she believed had already been assigned and accepted. I did not correct that assumption, because correction requires engagement, and engagement requires investment in a version of events I no longer needed to maintain. Instead, I focused on timing, because timing was now the only element that mattered. A brief vibration came again through my phone, subtle but definitive, and this time I did not delay acknowledgement internally. I simply registered it and allowed it to settle into place alongside everything else I had already observed. The structure of the evening, the behavior of the group, the confidence in their assumptions, all of it was still intact, but now it existed in parallel with something they could not yet see. I remained composed, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral, as Jessica continued speaking and the room continued responding exactly as it had been trained to respond throughout the night. But beneath that surface continuity, a transition point had already been reached, and I understood that what came next would not require interruption or confrontation, only presence at the precise moment when perception could no longer hold its current shape. The moment that followed did not announce itself, it simply arrived, not as sound or movement, but as a subtle reconfiguration of attention within the room. Jessica was still speaking when it began, her voice carrying the same comfortable confidence it had maintained throughout the evening, but there was a fraction of hesitation in the rhythm of the group that had not been there before. It was not visible in any single person, but in the spacing between reactions, in the slight delay between statement and response, as if the room itself had begun to recalibrate without informing anyone. I remained in the same position near the boundary of the space, neither stepping forward nor stepping back, because what was unfolding did not require participation, only observation at the correct moment. Mark Reynolds leaned slightly toward Jessica as if preparing to add another comment, but paused mid-motion, his attention shifting towards something outside the immediate conversation that had not been there a second earlier. Lily Carter's expression changed in the smallest way, not alarm, not confusion, but the kind of instinctive pause that occurs when familiar structure no longer feels entirely predictable. Jessica continued speaking for a brief second longer, unaware that the flow she had been controlling so easily was beginning to lose its consistency. I did not look at my phone again because I no longer needed confirmation of timing. I could feel it in the way the environment was no longer fully synchronized with itself. The sound of the room felt slightly different, not quieter, but more separated, as if each voice was now occupying its own distinct space rather than blending into a single social rhythm. Jessica finally stopped mid-sentence, not because she chose to, but because she noticed the shift in attention around her, and that single pause created a gap that had not existed before. In that gap, the illusion of continuity began to weaken. I took one step forward, slow and deliberate, not toward the group, but toward the center of the space where visibility was most balanced, and that movement alone caused several eyes to adjust toward me without conscious decision. Mark straightened slightly in his seat, his earlier confidence now filtered through uncertainty that he had not yet named, while Lily's gaze moved between Jessica and the entrance as if recalculating the context of everything she had just heard. Jessica looked at me directly for the first time in a while, but the expression she held was no longer aligned with the earlier version of the evening, because something in the atmosphere had already shifted the frame in which she was interpreting me. I did not speak, because speech at that moment would have been premature relative to what was already unfolding. Instead, I allowed the silence to expand naturally, and in doing so I could see how quickly people begin to search for explanation when the structure they rely on stops behaving as expected. A faint sound from the hallway reached the room, subtle but distinct enough to draw attention toward the entrance, and that single point of focus caused the group's arrangement to loosen further. Jessica turned her head slightly toward the sound, then back toward me, and in that brief motion I could see the first trace of uncertainty forming where certainty had been only moments before. Mark adjusted his posture again, now fully attentive, no longer participating in humor or commentary, while Lily's expression settled into quiet observation. I remained still, allowing the situation to reach its natural threshold without interference, because thresholds reveal themselves most clearly when nothing is forced. The room was no longer operating as a single unit of shared perception, it was beginning to divide into individual interpretations, and that division was irreversible once it started. Jessica finally spoke again, but her voice no longer carried the same ease it had before, and even the simplest words now felt like attempts to re-establish control over something that was no longer responding to it. I looked at her calmly, not with challenge, not with emotion, but with the awareness that the version of events she had been operating under had already reached its limit. And in that quiet realization, the foundation of the entire moment shifted from assumption to uncertainty, from certainty to observation, and from observation to consequence that had not yet fully revealed itself. The shift in the room was no longer subtle, it had reached a point where denial required more effort than acknowledgement, and I could see that effort beginning to fail across multiple faces at the same time. Jessica stood slightly straighter now, her earlier confidence replaced with a controlled stillness that suggested she was recalculating the situation in real time, trying to restore meaning to a moment that no longer fit her original assumptions. Mark Reynolds was no longer leaning back, his posture had adjusted forward in a way that signaled attention without certainty, while Lily Carter had stopped participating entirely, her expression now focused on understanding rather than responding. I remained in the same position, not advancing, not retreating, because the value of this moment was in allowing it to unfold without interference. The sound from the hallway had not repeated, but its presence had already altered the psychological structure of the room, and everyone inside it knew that something external had now entered their frame of reference. Jessica looked at me again, longer this time, searching not for confrontation, but for confirmation of something she could no longer fully define, and when she did not find it, her expression tightened slightly as if the absence of clarity itself was becoming uncomfortable. I did not offer explanation because explanation would have implied participation in their current confusion, and I was no longer operating within that layer of understanding. Instead, I allowed silence to remain intact, and that silence began to carry more weight than any earlier conversation. Mark shifted his gaze toward the entrance again, then back to Jessica, as if waiting for one of them to resolve what was happening, but neither of them did. Lily adjusted her hands on her glass without drinking, a small gesture that revealed more hesitation than words could express. Jessica finally spoke, but her tone had changed, less performative, more cautious, as if she was testing whether the environment still responded to her in the same predictable way. It did not respond in the way she expected, and that realization became visible in the smallest pause between her words. I took a slow step forward again, not toward any individual, but into a position where I was no longer at the periphery of perception, and that movement alone caused another subtle recalibration in the room's attention. No one interrupted, no one challenged, but the ease that had defined earlier moments was no longer present. There is a point in every controlled social environment where familiarity stops functioning as a shield, and that point had now been reached. Jessica's eyes held on me longer, and in that direct line of sight I could see the transition from certainty to evaluation, from evaluation to uncertainty, and from uncertainty to something she was not yet ready to name. Mark exhaled slightly, a controlled release of tension that suggested he was aware something had changed but not yet willing to define it. Publicly. Lily's attention shifted once more toward the entrance, and this time she did not return it immediately to the group. I remained silent, because silence at this stage was no longer absence of response, it was the active presence of control over timing. The room no longer felt like a single conversation, it felt like multiple interpretations of the same moment competing for resolution. Jessica finally lowered her hand from mid-gesture, stopping herself without completing the motion, and that incomplete action became more revealing than anything she had said earlier. I looked at her calmly, not with resistance, not with correction, but with the understanding that the version of reality she had been maintaining was no longer fully supported by what was now present. And in that realization, the structure of the evening reached its final point of instability, where everything that follows is no longer interpretation, but outcome. The moment the final shift settled into the room, it did not arrive with noise or disruption, it arrived with certainty, the kind of certainty that changes the meaning of everything that came before it without needing to announce itself. The attention in the room was already divided when the door finally opened, not abruptly, but with a calm precision that matched the atmosphere that had been building for several minutes. Everyone turned, not because they were startled, but because they had already been expecting something without knowing what it would be. Jessica's expression changed first, not into fear, but into confusion that had not yet found a label. Mark Reynolds straightened fully now, his earlier confidence gone, replaced with the stillness of someone realizing the context he was operating in was incomplete. Lily Carter's gaze locked on the entrance, her posture frozen in a way that suggested she was no longer participating in interpretation, only observation. The man who stepped into the room did not hurry, did not scan for approval, did not acknowledge the social energy that had dominated the space earlier. He simply entered as if the room itself was secondary to whatever purpose had brought him there. I did not turn immediately, because I already knew what was aligning into place, and timing at this stage was no longer about discovery, but confirmation. Jessica's voice tried to form something, but it stopped halfway, the sound never completing, as if language itself had become unreliable in that moment. The man looked across the room once, then focused his attention forward, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and final in a way that did not require volume to be understood. He said my name, Ethan Walker, and in that instant the structure of the evening collapsed into a different frame of reference. Jessica took a step back without realizing it, her earlier certainty dissolving into something that no longer supported her interpretation of events. Mark Reynolds looked between the man and me, recalculating everything he had assumed earlier, while Lily remained silent, her expression now fully detached from the conversation she had been part of minutes before. I finally turned fully toward the room, not as a participant, but as someone stepping into alignment with what had already been established outside of perception. The man continued, stating calmly that the matter being discussed earlier was not only incorrect in assumption, but irrelevant in scope, because the context everyone had been operating under did not reflect the actual structure of responsibility present in the situation. No one interrupted him, not because they agreed, but because interruption required confidence in an alternative narrative, and that confidence no longer existed in the room. Jessica looked at me now with a different expression, not anger, not disbelief, but recognition of something she had not accounted for, something that redefined the assumptions she had carried throughout the evening. I did not respond immediately, because response was no longer necessary to establish clarity. Instead, I allowed the silence to hold its weight, and in that silence the final adjustment occurred, where perception aligned with reality rather than assumption. The man finished speaking, confirming in simple terms that the role I had been reduced to earlier in the evening was never accurate, and that the reason for my presence had always been aligned with decisions that existed outside of this social environment. Mark lowered his gaze slightly, no longer attempting to interpret, while Lily remained still, as if any movement might confirm involvement she no longer wished to maintain. Jessica finally spoke my name, but this time it carried no certainty behind it, only a question that arrived too late to change the structure of what had already been revealed. I looked at her calmly, without anger or satisfaction, because either was required when clarity has already replaced confusion. And in that final moment, I understood that the evening had not been about proving anything to anyone inside the room. It had been about allowing assumptions to reach their natural conclusions so that reality could stand on its own without resistance. I turned slightly toward the exit, not in departure from conflict, but in completion of presence, and as I did, the room behind me remained silent, no longer operating under the belief that it fully understood what it had just witnessed.